I'm Cody Auger, chef owner of Nimblefish in Portland, Oregon. Today, I'm going to break down these whole fish and turn them each into a single piece of nigiri. So first thing we do is scale the fish. Basically, I'm using a scaler to take the large scales off of this sea bream. We're going to scale the fish with this kind of up and down movement, and what that does is it allows the scaler to kind of work its way in between the scales and pulls them away gently rather than in a way that could kind of damage or break the meat. It's very important, especially to get all the scales around the cut lines, which are going to be at the top and the bottom of the fish, and definitely right behind the head and the tail area where you're going to go through the spine on both sides to kind of start the cleaning process of the fish. So this is Thai or red sea bream. The Thai is a really rich piece of fish, very mild in flavor, but it has a lot of fat content, and especially with the kobujime process, it creates a bunch of umami within the fish. This is a Isaki 3-line grunt. Again, pretty similar process to the red sea bream. We're just gonna try to take the scales off with as minimal amount of damage to the fish as possible. Isaki is a seasonal spring to early summer fish. It's kind of similar to an ocean perch, really nice full-flavored whitefish. Typically, when you're eating whitefish, the flavors are pretty mild and it's almost more of a textural fish. But the Isaki has both great texture and a lot of flavor for a whitefish. This is Takabe yellow striped butter. This is coming from Tokyo, Japan. Summer seasonal fish, really nice fatty fish. The fish is being stored on ice, so when we scale the fish, it's nice to keep it at roughly the same temperature on ice. It also keeps the meat a little bit firmer while you scale the fish to hopefully create less potential for damage. This is kinmei, a seasonal item between summertime and also early January in the winter. Kinmei is a really tender, fatty whitefish that is coming from Chiba, Japan. One of the best fish that we serve that's served with the skin on. This is Shinko, really short season, young gizzard shad. This is coming from Shizuoka. I'm scaling this fish with my deba. It's a relatively fragile fish. The scales come off relatively easy, so I kind of just can pull them off with the back of my knife. It's definitely important to take the scales off the fish. This one in particular because we're going to serve the skin. Scales are definitely not something that you want to be eating, both because they're kind of for a sanitary reason, and then it's just not a pleasant mouth bite. These are Iwashi sardine. A lot of people refer to them as a fishy fish, but I just feel like they're a little bit more oily, and when prepared properly, they're not fishy at all. You just taste like all the fat and full flavor that they have to offer. This is aji. This is horse mackerel coming from Kyoto. Also, season is going to be spring to early summer. The aji's cutting really nice right now. It has great fat content. One of the reasons we're using it right now. This is Shima aji. So first I'm going to cut the top and bottom fin off just so that I have easier access to cut the scales off and to get a part of the fish off that is typically a little bit more for a sanitary purpose. This one, I'm going to cut the scales off instead of using the scaler. They have really fine scales. It's just a little bit easier and cleaner to do it this way. I'm trying to get in between the scales and the skin without cutting through the skin with the knife. You have to keep the bevel angle of your knife flat relative to the fish skin as you make a nice light sawing back and forth as you move across the fish. Here are the scaled fish. Now we're going to fillet them and get them ready for preparation. So for the cleaning and filleting process, I'm going to take off the head and tail first. Then we're going to remove the guts and then clean out the bloodline and get it ready for filleting. We're going to reserve the most usable meat. Towards the head, the sinew kind of concentrates in the fish anyway, and we won't use that first little triangle, but we definitely want to have the best starting point for the largest fillet that we can have. We definitely reserve the head. It's great for grilling sometimes or stock. So this is the fillet process of the fish. I'm going to basically be taking that first right side off, staying as close to the bones as possible to create the least amount of waste left on the bones. It's definitely very technique driven. Making very clean cuts and staying as close to the bones as possible is a big part of it, and really trying not to break the meat. Fish is fairly fragile and tends to want to break at the seams of the muscle rather easily, so making clean, precise cuts definitely helps in that. So this is going to be a 3-piece fillet. By Japanese standard, the bones are considered a portion of the fillet and both sides are considered a fillet. This is the kinmedai golden eye snapper. Again, we're taking off the tail and the head and the guts out first prior to filleting. The head and the guts are connected through their internal system. If I just cut through the spine, I'm able to keep that all intact and pull it out all at once. So we're always going to fillet a specific side of the fish. By Japanese standard, they're always stored facing the left side. So we're going to fillet the right side first because it receives the most stress because it's taking all the weight of the fish due to the way that it's packaged. We take the bones out of this fish post-filleting, actually, as we prepare to make the final stages before the nigiri process. This is the Isaki 3-line grunt. We're going to fillet this similar to the other fish, head and tail off, guts out, and then 3-piece fillet. So the bones on the Isaki tend to be a little bit more rigid, so it takes a little bit more pressure, and if I tap the back of my knife to get through the bones, it's going to create less pressure and a quicker cut than if I sat there and tried to saw through the spine. Isaki is not super popular, but it's also not uncommon to see this fish either. I would say in New York and LA this time of year, you're going to see it a lot. Not so much in the rest of the states. This is the Shima Aji, Trevally Jack, coming from Oita. I would say it's not super popular, but it is right now a aquacultured fish, so it has started to become popular. This one, however, is tenin or wild, which is definitely a lot more rare. I don't think you see wild Shima Aji at many sushi bars. Aquaculture refers to basically a farmed fish. The difference in flavor between farm fish and wild fish is going to be fat content and flavor of fat. Farm fish might have more fat content, but they're definitely lacking the character that the wild fish have. Wild fish fat, it definitely tends to be more sweet and have a lot more like variation in flavor. This is the Takabe yellow striped butter. This is also going to be a 3-piece fillet. Size definitely, I don't think, matters in the filleting until you get to something that's much larger. For instance, maybe tuna or something that's much smaller like the shinko. A lot of people tend to like fattier portions of fish. A lot of that is going to be coming from the bottom hemisphere of the fish or the belly side. Each fillet has a top hemisphere and a bottom hemisphere. The top hemisphere tends to be a little bit more lean and sturdy and less tender, but the belly side can have a little bit more fat content and a little bit more on the tender side. A lot of times fat adds sweetness and definitely holds a lot of the umami of the fish. This is aji horse mackerel. And this one is relatively similar to the other fish. The only thing different is it has a hard scale, kind of similar to the Shima Aji, and we're going to cut that off. However, this has already been scaled with the back of my knife previous to cutting this hard scale off. Outside of that, it's going to be roughly the same. It's a 3-piece fillet, both sides and the bones. Aji is definitely a very common fish you'll see at most sushi bars these days. A lot of times it's carried year-round and is farmed. These ones, however, happen to be in season. I really love aji. It's probably one of my favorite fish, actually. Texturally, it has a nice little crunch and snap to it, and it really has great flavor. As far as it being a mackerel, almost all mackerels lend to having really great flavor. And this one tends to be on the milder side for the mackerel, but definitely a lot of good flavor and a lot of good fat content as well. These are Iwashi sardine. We're going to fillet this one a little bit different than the previous ones. Still the same process for cleaning. Removing the head, taking out the guts. However, we're going to leave the tail on this time because it helps in the filleting process. We're going to cut 2 incisions on the bottom and basically fillet it with our hands by pulling the spine and the bones out really gently to try to get as many of the bones out of the sardine as possible. At the end, we're going to end up with a 1-piece fillet, so the 2 fillets are attached together, and this is going to create a better medium for me to do the curing process. So this is the Shinko. This fish is going to be a little bit different than what we've been doing so far. It's going to be a 2-piece fillet. So we're going to clean it, cut it into a single fillet, and also make sure that all the scales and fins are off because we're going to serve the whole thing as is once it's been pickled or prepared. All the other bones that are in this fish stay in this fish, and through the pickling process will soften up. Definitely is a little bit more difficult, very tedious. It takes a little bit more skill to cut this fish, being that it's so small. After I fillet the fish, I'm gonna shake it off in the ice water. One, it creates a shinier skin, and it also cleans off the fish from anything that I've left on there after the filleting and cleaning process. This is the tachio or belt fish. It's a 3-piece fillet. However, we're gonna not use all of it at the same time, so I'm gonna cut it in half. First, we're going to cut the dorsal fin off, which runs the entire back of the fish. It doesn't have another fin on the bottom side of the fish as most fish do. Tachio is a relatively meaty fish, really dense, pretty oily. We keep the skin on it. There's no scales on this fish, really, and it has a huge amount of fat between the skin and the meat, so another reason why we're reserving the skin on the fish. The guts are pretty standard. There's always like a cavity for where that area is, so very easy to find, and pretty much you want to get rid of everything that's in there. We do have some things that you might reserve from the innards from fish from time to time, such as the heart or the liver, or eggs if they're there. Sometimes we'll open up the guts and there will be whole fish in there like they just ate right before they got caught. And so here we're just filleting the fish just like we would in either of the other fish that we've filleted. However, this one's been cut in half prior to filleting. Tachio is a very thin fish to begin with, so the fillets or the sides are very thin. I would say at max they're about 3/4 of an inch thick. The tachio is kind of one of the harder fish to fillet that we're working on today, just due to the fact that it's long and requires long, precise strokes. Also, the bones are relatively delicate and easy to cut through and damage the other side of the fillet. The long, precise strokes are definitely something that you learn over time and getting comfortable with the way it feels to fillet a fish. But being very clean with your cuts is kind of something that is pretty standard practice for being a sushi chef. I moved this fillet closer to the edge of the cutting board because it just sits in a funny way once that first side is taken off, and so I can get a better angle at it by cutting from below the cutting board level. This is the Aorti Ika big fin reef squid. What we're gonna do to start is remove the ears and skin from the mantle, which is kind of the main portion that we're gonna be using for sushi. Right here, I'm just using my knife to kind of start an area that I can get the skin away from the mantle and remove the ears and the skin. I'm pushing my hand in between the mantle and the skin to kind of peel the skin away from the main squid tube or mantle. So the goal in this process is basically to separate the usable parts and take the skin off anything we're going to be reserving for use for sushi. For the most part, we're going to use just the mantle for the sushi. The legs will be prepared in a different way, and we'll use them for some of the otsumami or small courses of our omakase program. Squid is a pretty unique product for sushi. There's probably the most variety of squids than any other single fish that we serve for sushi based on the season. The Aorti Ika in particular is going to be a summer squid. Definitely very prized for its texture. It also tends to be relatively sweet, and it's packed with a ton of natural umami. At this point, we pull the legs out of the mantle with all of the innards attached to them. The ink sac ruptured. If it's whole, we can harvest it and salt it and basically preserve it for sauces. You can add it to pasta, dough if you'd like. It's actually really easy to clean. It literally rinses off with water relatively easy. At this point, I'm trying to separate the liver. However, it was a little weak, and so we're not going to reserve it and use it. The liver is pretty popularly used in Japan to make a small plate called shiokara, which is basically salted and fermented squid liver. The tentacles and the head are attached. We'll basically take the beak out and some hard cartilage pieces that we have to remove, and the eyeballs before we can cut away all the usable pieces. There's definitely not a lot of knife work on this one. Mostly we're just trying to pull things apart in a clean way and then basically separate them into the usable pieces and pull the skin off. So majority of it is handwork. I just pulled out the quill of the squid, which is going to be basically like its spine. It's just more or less like a large piece of cartilage that kind of helps keep the structure of the squid. Otherwise it would be pretty squishy and formless. Now there's a layer of skin, and actually what was starting to form were eggs for reproduction as well. So there's a layer of skin on the inside, a couple layers of skin on the inside of the Aorti Ika as well, which needs to be taken off, which I'm going to use my towel to kind of start that process, and then I'll use my hands to kind of pull the majority of the rest of it away. It definitely wants to break and pull apart in like strands, however, which can make it kind of difficult. It really just depends on how fresh the squid is. I'm able to get this stuff off pretty easy because the squid is super fresh and all of it's coming off in relatively large pieces. We have squid that we serve as a whole squid for a single piece of nigiri, and we also have squid like this that can basically, you can harvest about 30 to 40 pieces of nigiri off of this guy. There's a little hard part on the inside of the mantle, which is going to be those two pieces you see about a third into the mantle on either side. And that bottom portion of the mantle is going to be relatively hard and crunchy as well, so we'll remove all of that. So, here are all the filleted fish. Now let's get them prepared for the case. Right here I'm kind of separating the fish into different curing processes on the zaru. It's something that we can salt fish or store vegetables on that allows breathability. With the fish on the right zaru, these are all fish that I'm going to lightly salt and pull a little bit of the water and unwanted flavor out of the fish. The one on the left also is going to get like a medium to light salting, again to pull out water and unwanted flavor, and then it's going to get a vinegar rinse. So a lot of these are pretty quick, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes on the salt. The shinko, however, is going to be more of a sujime, which is going to be like a vinegar cure. So the salt process on that's going to be, depending on size, anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes for light to medium salt, and then we're going to also vinegar for roughly that same time. What I'm doing right here with the shinko is I salted the zaru itself first for the skin side of the shinko, and then we'll come through with a light dusting of salt from the flesh side as well. The salt that we try to use for this process is going to be something that's going to be a larger grain, a little bit more mineral driven, just for the cure process. The larger salt helps from actually making the fish taste salty and rather more of something that's pulling things out of the fish. This is a pretty traditional way to get sushi ready for service. I would say it's a pretty standard practice amongst like people that are preparing edamame sushi. We definitely do a more curated and cured sushi style or edamame style for sure. There's definitely things that are served super fresh as well, but we serve very simply and really let the rice and the fish kind of shine. Right here we're gonna basically, after that kinmei's been salted for a little bit and gotten a chance to sweat and pull a little bit of water out, we're gonna cook the skin side with hot water, which is called yubiki, and then throw it really quickly into an ice bath. Ice bath is there to immediately shock and stop the cook process. So the flesh of the fish is not going to be cooked at all, however the skin is going to be cooked through enough to the point where it's edible. Here we're just going to pat it dry and now it's ready for service. So the tuna, I'm going to take sakus off of it, or blocks that would be ready for sushi. However, we're going to do a cure on this one as well. It's going to be a soy zuke or shoyu zuke. So we're going to take these sakus, cook them on the outside really quickly or lightly with hot water again, yubiki style, and then put them in a soy marinade for roughly 9 to 10 minutes. We're going to do a shoyu zuke process for this. So shoyu is just the word for soy sauce in Japanese, and it's going to be the basis of our marinade. It's going to be a majority soy sauce. We're going to use a little bit of mirin or sweet sake and a little bit of regular sake as well. In both cases, the sake, the alcohol's been cooked off. Soy, meaning sake are kind of some of the major fundamental key ingredients for seasoning in Japanese cuisine. Different ratios can change the flavor profile pretty dramatically, and definitely a lot of it's used in the curing processes as well. I would say like our soy sauce is going to be less sodium just due to the fact that we fortify it with a bunch of other things. So we add ingredients to it and prepare it in a certain way through heating and adding like kombu and katsuo and sake and meating. So it basically gets thinned out and would be equivalent to being less sodium. So the Shima Aji and the Isaki have now been salted and they've sweated a little bit, and a little bit of the moisture has been pulled out from each fish. And now we're just rinsing them really quickly in a bath of ice water, basically to remove the salt. We're trying to make sure that all the salt did was pull a little bit of moisture out of the fish and unwanted flavor and not season the fish. Now we're gonna do the vinegar washing process for the hikarimono. So all of the sardines and aji that have been filleted and salted now have been sweated for a little bit, and we're gonna rinse the salt off with a little bit of vinegar. In the right bowl, there is vinegar that's been diluted with a little bit of water, and that's gonna be for the marinade for the shinko. This is the sardine. We are rinsing in the full strength vinegar just really quickly to remove excess salt. We're doing the Takabe now, and this is going to be a seared piece where we cook the skin via heating up a good amount of salt. So heavy salt on the skin, and then we're going to use the torch to heat the salt, which will in turn cook the skin without leaving any char marks, so the skin looks relatively fresh and alive still. So the salt is in turn going to do the cooking rather than the torch. Once the heat is applied, the skin's going to kind of tighten up. It'll definitely contract, and it'll also then like kind of relax right after it gets to the point where it's been cooked to the point where we can throw it in the ice bath. For our purpose, we're gonna serve the skin on this one. So it's nice to have it at a nice tender edible point before we actually make the sushi with it. There's definitely different schools of thought on it. Some people do it to order, kind of after they cut the fish, and we do that with some of the fish as well. We do that with the Isaki, where we leave the skin on raw, and we will cook it in its entirety right before we make the nigiri. But this one is just a little bit nicer done this way because we don't have to necessarily sear it for the service of the nigiri portion. Most of the fish that you see are pretty traditionally served with the skin on. The skin definitely adds another characteristic of flavor, and on top of that preserves a layer of fat between the skin and the meat. With the tachio, we're going to do the salt cooking as well. So heavy salt on the skin and letting the torch heat the salt to in turn cook the skin. Now the maguro zuke is ready for service. It's been marinated for about 9 minutes, and now we're just going to pat it dry and it's ready for the case. The marinade's going to slightly season the saku of fish, but it's also going to create umami or more flavor or depth of flavor in the fish. So here we are going to take the shinko that's been salted. Now it's been salted for about 20 minutes. We're going to rinse it in full strength vinegar so we remove any excess salt, and now it's going in the vinegar with a little water dilution for the marinade process for about 20 minutes. This is the tachio or belt fish. Here we're just going to pat it dry, and now it's ready for service. So this is the Thai or Red Sea Bream, and now we're going to do a kobujime process. The kobujime process is going to be basically a kelp and salt cured process. So I'm going to take a towel and get it moist with a little bit of sake, and I'm going to rinse the kombu of its excess salt with the sake. Then we're going to take the fillets of this fish, skin them, lightly salt both sides, and press it between the kombu for about an hour and a half for service. This is a really traditional technique. It's definitely something that creates a ton of umami within the fish via the kelp and the salt, and changes the texture to being a little bit more firm. Some people will go really mild on the kobujime, which is, I would say we do, at an hour and a half. Some people would put it in for almost an entire day. It'll turn into the texture of almost like a gummy bear at that point. So here are all the case-ready cuts. Now let's turn them into sushi. So now we're going to make the tamago. Tamago is a Japanese-style egg omelet. First, we're going to separate the whites from the yolks. Then we're going to whip the whites to almost a half meringue and incorporate the seasoned dashi. Dashi is a Japanese stock, kind of the staple or fundamental for Japanese cooking, that is made with typically kelp and dried fish. And the dashi for this is that plus seasoning via mirin or sweet sake, sugar, and soy sauce as well. Then we're gonna emulsify the vegetable oil with the egg yolk, and then combine both the whites and the yolks together. So tamago translates literally to egg. It doesn't even necessarily mean a chicken egg, but it's definitely an older practice. The style of omelet that we make is a dashimaki, which is basically a layered and flipped egg omelet. So we're gonna slowly heat the pan at kind of a low to medium heat just to make sure that it's absorbing as much of the oil that we have in there due to the fact that it's not a non-stick pan and it is a stainless steel on the inside of the pan. So now the pan's seasoned and we're gonna remove the oil and wipe it out and prepare to make the omelet. Tamago has kind of traditionally been a way that people can rate or figure out how good a sushi restaurant is. Traditionally, people would sometimes order tamago as their first bite when they arrived at the sushi bar, and if the sushi chef could prepare a proper dashimaki or tamago, then they would continue to order more pieces. Nowadays, tamago is served at the end kind of like a finishing or dessert piece. So pretty much we're taking this omelet and pouring it layer by layer and flipping it, and it's going to get folded over twice before we get to this kind of base shape, and then it's going to get pushed forward to the front of the pan, and we're going to continue to pour layers and push the egg batter underneath the previously made omelet and continue that process over and over until we're out of the egg. So we're just going to be flipping that egg over and over. I think a lot of people think that this is the hardest part, but realistically the hardest part for me is just controlling that heat and making sure that that thing's not sticking. I would say that we pour about 8 or 9 layers for ours, and then we'll end up with almost 18 layers that way due to the amount of flips. Now I'm just making sure that the outside is nice and sealed up with the heat so that it holds its structure. After the tamago has been finished, I'm gonna pull it off onto the makisu, which will give it some air and give it time and availability to kind of set up and finish. Now we're gonna start slicing the cuts for the nigiri. Nigiri sushi is going to be fish over rice. Sashimi is going to be sliced fish without rice. And teimaki is going to be a hand roll or personal sushi roll. So all these fish that we have, we're gonna take a slice off of each of them and get them ready to make nigiri. Each fish is a little bit different as far as what thickness and size of cut we're gonna make, or whether we're gonna score it or not score it. Just depends on the texture and what the fish is. There's definitely a standard of how you should be cutting your sushi. It should always be against the grain. You don't want the grains to be elongated, so it kind of depends on the fish or what side of the fillet you're working on to which direction I'm gonna cut it. Here I'm gonna do a good amount of scoring of the squid. It's gonna make the texture for the bite a little bit more appealing, especially since it's a thicker squid. And it's also gonna bring out a little floral aroma of the squid as well. We want all of our sushi to look uniform, but we don't want to put a lot of pressure on the rice. The rice should stay nice and fluffy and light. Definitely shouldn't be something that you have to work at chewing when it's in your mouth. And in order to do that, some of the fish are going to be a little bit stiffer and need just a little bit of scoring to lay on the sushi properly without having to really mold it with your hands. You should try to do one fluid stroke to make one long cut for the nigiri and then kind of turn your angle right at the end to cut straight down to the board. If you're cutting off of the skin, however, it's a little bit different, which we tend to keep the skin on because we have a lot of fish that once the skin's off looks fairly similar. It's an easier way for us to differentiate the fish. I'm using my yanagiba for this. The yanagiba has been designed specifically for slicing of sushi. This is the tachio or beltfish. I'm just going to remove the ribs really quickly and then it's ready to cut for sushi as well. And this is one that we haven't cooked the skin on, but the skin is going to be served And typically for service, we would torch that immediately prior to. And when making nigiri, the ratio of fish to rice is super important. So we don't make a huge size of sushi, but we also don't make a small sushi either. I feel like sushi should be a single bite and it shouldn't be uncomfortable in your mouth, whether it's too big or too small. So here's the dashimaki. We typically like to do a nice thick cut for the egg omelet. And now it's time to make the nigiri. To make nigiri, we need rice, the neta or fish, wasabi, and a little seasoning depending on the variety of fish. So our rice, we use a premium short grain Calrose rice. We also use a red vinegar for the seasoning. In the red vinegar is a little bit of mirin, salt, and sugar, and that's pretty much the main ingredients. So here we're making the nigiri one at a time. I think the goal in making this nigiri is to make something that's visually appealing, not to press the rice too much, keep it nice and light and fluffy upon making the nigiri, and then just making sure that the ratio of rice to fish is proper. So I'm going to wet my hands with water in order to keep the rice from sticking to my hands. And then I'm going to add wasabi to the fish, introduce the rice, and now start forming the rice in a way that keeps it light and fluffy. So in the hand motion through the making of the nigiri, I'm constantly trying to separate the rice from a shape and make it nice and airy in between the rice kernels, and then form it again throughout each motion until we've done pretty much both sides of the fish. I turn it once or twice and then get the pressure proper, and then hopefully the shape is right as well. Basically, I'm squeezing or more or less forming the nigiri with as little amount of pressure as possible. The second hand comes into play to kind of press the sushi almost, but at that same time you're kind of separating the rice again to create more air, and then there's a final like top and side squeeze to get the proper shape at the end. Everyone kind of makes nigiri, I think, a little bit differently. I try to use a pretty traditional technique with mine though, as little and as quick as possible. I still don't feel like 100% competent at it. I feel like I'm constantly trying to improve this skill, like on a daily basis. I think that the sushi process for me could be a lifelong process in general, striving to be as good as I can possibly be, knowing that I'm never going to be able to do it perfectly. I think when someone comes into our restaurant, I just really want them to have a really lovely experience and enjoy something that we enjoy providing for people and curating on a daily basis. It's really nice to see people enjoy the things that you do. And this is the process from whole fish to final plating.